and as promised, lighter, brighter video. Can you see me? Yeah? Okay, good. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the difference between sweet and dry wine, right? So that you know the differences between the two. And also we're going to talk about the different kinds of sweet wine, because it's not just one. There's the one style that we're used to and is the common one and we know, and I'm really going to emphasize on that one a little bit more, but I also want you to be aware of the other kinds of sweet wine, right? Just so that you have rounded knowledge on it. Okay, so let's start. Now, dry wine is what we refer to when we're talking about wine that has no residual sugars in it, which, if you remember how wine is made, it's grape juice, yeast. Yeast acts on the grape juice, eats up the sugar, producing alcohol, and that's how wine is made. Now, if you let the yeast do its job to the finish, right, and it eats all the sugar, then you get dry wine, right? But as a result, you also get higher alcohol, right? Because when the yeast acts on the sugars, it produces alcohol. So let me show you two examples of dry white wine. This is a Spear Chardonnay. It's a dry white. And as you can see here, the alcohol by volume is 13.5%, right? And that's a dry Chardonnay, so a dry white. I also have with me a dry red, okay? Montmarie Director's Reserve, it's a red. It's a blend of grapes, I'm sure, but it's a red. And if you looked at the alcohol by volume, see it says 14%. So that's around the percentage of alcohol that you should expect from a dry wine. And then, of course, no sugar, okay? These two do not have any residual sugar. So now that we've understood that, and now that we understand, or we've reminded ourselves how wine gets made, let's talk about the different kinds of sweet wine. Now, if you think about it, what are the two ways you could probably, and we're just talking about wine right now, what are the two ways you could probably ensure that your wine is sweet? Are you thinking about it? The first one is to make sure that the yeast doesn't finish the sugar, right? We just need the yeast to do its thing for a little bit, and then we need it to get out of there. So we need to stop fermentation one way or another, and then we get left off with the residual sugar in the grapes, and then we have sweet wine. Now, the second way of making sweet wine is pretty obvious. Like you'd add sweetness to coffee or tea, they add sweetness to wine. Yeah, they do. But it's not, they don't go get honey or canderel or cane sugar like you do for your coffee or your tea. No, only grapes allowed. So what they do is that they either add some sweetened, some reserve grape juice or grape must, or like juice from really sweet grapes, pretty much grape syrup, and that's how they make the wine sweet, right? So let's start with that one, get that out of the way, right? This, okay, as you can see, it says Cape Medium Dessert Wine, right there, Cape Medium Cream Dessert Wine. So this is a sherry style of wine, right? Because it's been made in a sherry way, like they make sherry in Spain. And it's, when you see medium, when you're talking about sherry style wines, that means it has sweetness in it, okay? The medium cream, sorry. You have to see medium cream, those two words important, right? And that's a style of sweet wine. Now, I have actually a real sherry bottle from Spain. But the reason I was using that one first is because they don't say medium cream. They assume you know. They only say medium there. And also this name, this is a brand name. I didn't want it to confuse you by, you know, dry sack, and we're talking about dry and sweet wine, and I'm holding up this bottle saying it's sweet, but that's just a brand name, so ignore it. But you can see here, it's a sherry and it says medium. Okay. And at the back, where there's a description, I don't know if you can read it, but it mentions these Pedro Jimenez grapes. And those are it's a type of grape that produces really sweet, syrupy, dark wine. So that's what they do. They take the sherry Palomino grapes, and then once the sherry is made, they sweeten it with a dose of Pedro Jimenez. And that's how they add sweetness. Because remember, we can't add cane sugar. You have to add grapes. Now, another style of wine that adds sugar to the wine, and you might not know this, or you might, but sparkling wine, right? So as you can see, it's a cava from Spain as well. We're getting a bit of glare because white bottle, but it says cava right there. And at the back, right here, it says semi-seco cava. So semi-seco or demi-sec is, they say it's medium dry, but that'll confuse you. Just remember that demi-sec and semi-seco can have actually up to 50 grams of sugar in a liter. So that's a considerable amount of sweetness. And what they do is that once they've made the sparkling wine, there's a step that is called dosage, where they actually dose it with the grape juice, right? Just to bring out that sweetness. And if you see a bottle that says Brut or Brut Nature, that's a dry style, okay? A Brut Nature will probably not have any residual sugar in it. And if you want something that's sweeter when it comes to sparkling wine, look for the demi-sec, semi-seco, or doux, right? Now, that's when they just add the sugar. So now let's talk about when you achieve sweetness by not letting the yeast finish its job, right? So there are two ways that the yeast gets prevented from finishing its job. Now, the first one is by starting off with grapes that are so sweet that those sweet conditions are not great for the yeast. So you'll add the yeast and it'll try its best to do its job, produce some alcohol, but eventually it'll die off because that super sweet condition is not conducive to its growth. So the extremely high sugars in the grape must, or grape juice that you started with, naturally cannot support yeast and it dies off, right? And such super sweet grapes are achieved in different ways. So they can be achieved by noble rot, which is a kind of fungus that actually in the right conditions will dry out the grapes and kind of like shrink them and really concentrate those sugars. The fungus is called Botrytis cinerea. So if you see a wine that says it's been affected by botrytis or botrytis, then you know it's a noble rot wine. Another way is by literally they harvest the grapes and dry them out in the sun like they're making raisins. And that is what they use to make the grape must. So you can imagine making wine out of like raisins. The sugar will be really concentrated and then the yeast can't survive in that environment. So after working a little bit, they're like, yeah, I can't, they're out. So let me show you an example of a wine that was made by using grapes that are so sweet that the yeast cannot survive in that environment. And for that, I have this here. It's a German wine, and it's Beeren Oschlause. And this is a wine that's actually made from grapes that have been affected by noble rot. Okay, so it's botrytized, right? And because the yeast did not finish their job, what can you expect from such a wine? Aside from it being sweet, you can expect that the alcohol is not that high. So see that? It's 9% of alcohol. And you can see the bottle is also quite small. It's like half a regular bottle, so it's 0.375 liters, right? Such wines come in these kinds of small bottles because production of them is not too high, and they're actually quite rare. So chances of you just like randomly running into that kind of wine are slim. Now, the other way that yeast gets prevented from doing its job is by human intervention, right? I know I want to make a sweet wine. I know that if I let the yeast finish doing its job, it will not be sweet. So what will I do? I want to kill the yeast, right? And how do they kill the yeast? Several ways. Now, they can either kill the yeast by freezing the wine, or at least chilling it to a point where it's at a temperature that cannot support the yeast growth. So the yeast dies out and they filter the yeast out, or adding something to a chemical to kill the yeast, which usually they add a gas. It's sulfur dioxide. So that's what they use to kill the yeast. So they let the yeast do its thing. And then when they decide, this is the level of sweetness we want to achieve, so we need to get rid of this yeast, they either chill it or they dose it with the sulfur dioxide, filter the yeast, get it out of there, and bottle the wine. Now, they have to make sure that they get rid of the yeast after chilling, because if you leave that yeast and you bottle the wine, it'll just keep fermenting. So chill it or dose it with the SO2, then they filter it out and get it out of there. And that is actually the vast majority of sweet wines that you're going to encounter. So when you go to a restaurant or the supermarket and you say, hey, I'm looking for a sweet wine, or, you know, the sweet wines, I'm sure you know the brands of sweet wines that you like to buy, that's probably how they've been made. And that's the vast majority of sweet wine that you're going to find in the market, right? And then for that, the example I have here is a tall horse Moscato, right? And usually such wines are going to either have monikers like natural sweet, okay, because they didn't add anything, they just got sweet grapes and stopped the fermentation. And as you can see here, 8% alcohol by volume. Can you see? There we go. 8% alcohol. So all wines that have been made by stopping yeast action are going to be lower in alcohol. And that's where the vast majority of sweet wines lie, right? So when you see your late harvest, which literally means that they harvested the grapes a bit late when they are riper and therefore have more sugar and are sweeter, and natural sweet, they're going to be still like this and they're going to have lower alcohol because we did not let the yeast do its thing till the end. Now, there's one last way that we human beings and winemakers can stop the yeast from doing its job. And I'll give you a clue. Because we live in pandemic times, think of something that you now have become used to carrying in your pocket and handbag that kills microorganisms. Sanitizer, right? And what does sanitizer contain? Alcohol. So alcohol is a way that human beings or the winemaker will intervene and kill the yeast, right? So you add alcohol to a point where the yeast can no longer survive. Remember, there's still sugar left in it, and if you leave it alone, the yeast will continue acting on it, but you want to get rid of that yeast. So you just dump in alcohol, it kills the yeast. Make sure you have residual sugar. It makes sure that you have the residual sugar left in the wine. But then what have you done by extension? You've increased the alcohol percentage of that wine. Yes, you have your sugar left because you've gotten rid of the yeast, but you've gotten rid of the yeast in a way that increases the alcohol percentage, right? And in that, long story short, your sweet wines are either going to be higher than normal in alcohol or lower than normal in alcohol. But the vast majority of the ones that you're going to get are the ones that are lower than usual in alcohol. And then just one last example. This is a port, okay? It's a ruby port, and as you can see there, it's 19% alcohol. And again, achieved by adding grape spirit, okay? Because you can't go and get vodka or whiskey. Everything must be from grapes. So they add grape spirit to the wine, and that's how they kill the yeast. So I hope I've kind of demystified the difference between dry and sweet, and also the different kinds of sweet wines that you can find in the market. But if you forget everything else, always remember that the vast majority of sweet wines that you're going to find are going to be still. They're going to be made from intervening in the winemaking process and killing the yeast early by chilling and filtration or by using sulfur dioxide, and they're going to be lower in alcohol. In case something's not clear, you're always welcome to drop it down in the comments and ask me. I will try my best to answer you. Okay? And don't forget to like, comment, share this video with your friends and your family, and we'll see you next time. Bye, guys.